Vice President for the Southwest. I'm also the Vice President for the MAA as well. So I have kind of a dual position with both organizations, and it's a wonderful opportunity to also bring in something like this webinar, which puts together as co-sponsors the MAA with AMATYC and other sponsors here that are part of the National Math Summit. We'll talk more about the National Math Summit here at the end of today's webinar, but we have NOS and Carnegie Math Pathways and the Dana Center as sponsors also of all of this that we're talking about today. So I have a few things just to kind of do for housekeeping to make sure we're doing okay in terms of the webinar. So there we go. Oop, there's a delay. All right, just so everybody knows, we're going to be monitoring some questions in the chat. So feel free to post your questions in the chat. Some of the speakers who aren't going to be speaking at the very moment you post your question might be able to answer those questions, or we might just queue them up for the end of today's webinar and take care of the questions at the end. So don't hesitate at any time when you have that burning question to go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll take care of it today. If you wouldn't mind, speaking of the chat, going ahead and putting in the chat where you're from and maybe what attracted you to enroll in today's webinar, just so we can get a sense of where everybody's coming from and why they're here. Just to let you know, AMATYC is recording this webinar. We also at AMATYC retain the right to, oops, somehow there's a delay. Retain the right to show this webinar recording again and distribute it. And by participating, you are agreeing that your contributions become part of this recording. Please make sure that you are muted, and for bandwidth purposes, you might also turn off your video if you're comfortable doing that. Turn it back on when you have questions to ask, or in just a few moments, we'll actually be doing some breakout sessions as well, so you can have your video and sound on at that time. We'll have, as I mentioned, limited time to address questions, so be sure to put those in the chat. I don't know that we're expecting 300 attendees, but of course, be open to new ideas and be kind in your comments to others. Also, one last thing, the views expressed by the presenters are not necessarily the views of AMATYC. Commercial products mentioned by presenters are not endorsed by AMATYC. And having said all of that, I would love to turn this over to our wonderful presenters today for the webinar on transformational practices to incorporate active learning in mathematics courses. And Molly, I'll pass to you.
All right, and actually I'll just be welcoming us to this session. So we're going to be doing transformational practices to incorporate active learning in mathematics courses. This is based on the SEMINAL Project. That has been a project we've been part of for many years. There's been 3 phases. So my name is Rebecca Meachin. I'm with the University of Colorado Boulder. And then we have Molly Williams and Wendy Smith, who have been part of the data collection process for SEMINAL since phase 1. So how we're going to start our presentation today is I'm actually going to just give us the outline. So we're going to be thinking about and kind of reimagining where we're going N years from now when it comes to transforming math classrooms. And so part of that is going to come with learning about the change levers that may be required. And those will be from our SEMINAL phase 1 project that we were part of. We're then going to look at connecting and discussing the change levers to systems that influence the ability to make change and actually transform practices within departments. And then just in general, what cultural change would look like for your specific institution or an institution in general, and then just resources that may be helpful for you as you move forward back to your department if you're looking to make change specifically with active learning. So what would be great is if you could take out a pen and a pad of paper. We're going to just participate in a free write. So this is something that It's really nice just to ground us with why we're coming here today. I know many of you have put in the chat the institutions you're at, the reasons that you're looking at coming here. It'd be great now to reflect on just the situation. So I'm just going to read this aloud. Imagine a situation N years in the future where your department has achieved equitable student outcomes in mathematics. Students are actively engaged in doing mathematics and are becoming proficient at solving mathematical problems. What does this look like? What will it look like? What are the mathematical experiences that you hope students will be having? How will you know that there's equitable outcomes for those students? And then what changes will need to be leveraged in order to achieve this vision? So we're going to give you 2 minutes. You're welcome to turn off your camera as you're doing this free write. And then we're going to put in the chat, because we want you to at least sit and write for about a minute. We're going to put in the chat a link where you're going to share your ideas. And we're going to come back to that later. Everything's going to be anonymized, so you do not have to worry about posting within this link that we're going to have in the chat. So go ahead and take about 2 minutes. Like I said, you're welcome to turn off your camera and just write about where you see your department moving forward regarding these questions. So it's been about a minute. We'd love you to continue writing as you're thinking about these things. For those of you that you have answers already written down, we've put the link in the chat. So go ahead and click on that link and type in a short phrase to capture what your department will look like in the future, what you're hoping to envision with that. I'll give you about another 15 to 20 seconds to go ahead and actually click on that link and to put in a phrase. right. Thank you for participating in the free write. Like I said, I just wanted us to kind of ground ourselves in why we're here today, what we're thinking about when it comes to transforming our departments. We will be coming back to your answers here a little bit further into the presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Molly.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. Oh, okay. So for the next part of this webinar, we want to share with you some of the change levers that we discovered from the seminal phase 1 data. And before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what the Seminal Project is. And before I do that, I want to talk about what is the problem in the research that the Seminal Project is grounded in. So what is the problem as Seminal saw it? So math departments serve a lot of students. About 95% of students are enrolled in some mathematics class at the Calculus 2 level or below. And departments are struggling with student success. So there's an average of about 25% DFW rates at R1 institutions, and actually maybe even a little bit closer to 50% if you zoom in a little bit. And we know that students are dropping out, are often failing math classes. And in that students who, after their freshman year, a lot of students are switching away from STEM majors. So in addition to this, the overall beliefs and attitudes towards mathematics are trending negatively. So there's a really big problem with departments failing to engage students in ways that help them succeed academically and help them create positive attitudes towards teaching and learning mathematics. So if we think about how people learn, this downward oriented triangle represents things that people can do when learning. And if you think about the bottom point of this triangle, it's representing more passive actions that people can do, like read or listen to someone talking about math. And as we move up the triangle, there are more engaging actions that students can do, like actually doing math problems or teaching others how to do math problems. And what research has shown is that as you move up this triangle, the more engaging actions lead to a larger or a more amount of learning that is happening. So if we think about how is this aligning with how we teach math, then historically, most of our math teaching, instruction, and learning have been towards the bottom point of this triangle and these more passive actions. But lately, we've had more interest of teachers and students wanting the classroom, mathematics classroom, to be more engaging. So have more of these active actions happening in the class. So this has led to this idea of active learning. And I want to eventually share the definition that we used for active learning, but I want to pause and have you all tell us what is your definition of active learning. So in the actual chat box on this Zoom, just type in a word or a phrase that represents how you would define active learning. So I'm gonna pause and give us about a minute to do this. And Wendy and Rebecca, because I'm sharing, I can't actually see the chat box, so I'm gonna rely on you all to help share out what's being shared. So I'm gonna give about a minute and you guys can just kind of help me see, summarize what's being shared. Got about 15 seconds left. All right, so Wendy and Rebecca, if you can help
Yep.
summarize.
We're seeing a lot about students doing, students being engaged, students discussing with each other, a little bit about instructors, like the instructors are actively listening, the instructors are helping to make sense, but a lot focus on the students working together in groups, investigating, predicting, student sense making.
Great.
Lots of emphasis on the student doing more work than the teacher.
Great. Yeah. Okay. So as we hoped, you guys were hitting on definitely part of the definition that we used as our definition of active learning. So we took this definition from Larson and Rasmussen's 2019 work. So they define active learning as teaching methods and classroom norms that promote students' deep engagements in mathematics, which sounds like it was definitely thrown out there in the chat box. And then a focus on student-to-student interaction, and not always a focus on teacher-to-student interaction. And then in this definition, they also point out that this definition of active learning has the instructor interest in and use of student thinking, and then the instructor's attention to equitable and inclusive practices. So this was Seminal's definition and understanding of what active learning is. And so in addition to this definition, there has been research out there that has helped us see that using active learning in the classroom can result in students not only increase achievement, but also improve dispositions. And that further research has supported the idea that using active learning is particularly well suited for those underrepresented groups, okay? So more and more departments in higher education are becoming interested in incorporating active learning into their departments in some ways, right? And so this has triggered the idea that they need to usually change from what's been happening in their department. So this has caused Seminal to go and think about, well, what's the research on change? So there's research out there that supports that if you have an n-dimensional problem, like changing a department to using active learning, you cannot solve that problem with a 1 or 2 dimensional solution. It has to be solved using an n-dimensional solution. So research on change says that departments need to have a systemic approach, and that cultural change in particular is really important for departments to shift away from using lecture as the norm. And that cultural change encompasses the people, the power, the structures, and the beliefs that are embedded within the department. So these are ideas that we'll end with today, but these are really important. In addition, this is a framework that we have created that is synthesized from a lot of different research on change and what does effective change look like. So this particular framework is showing what the effective change process looks like. So departments who are wanting to make effective change, and this is the process that effective change goes through. So as you can see, it's cyclical in nature, and you can have different size scales of goals that are going through this process. So for example, if a department has a very large scale goal of implementing coordination within one course or even multiple courses, they have to go through this process. They have to decide what are the goals of this coordination? How is that coordination fitting within our current system in our department? And then they have to create a plan for actually how they're going to implement coordination and create measures for how they'll assess that plan. Then they'll have to actually enact that plan and collect the measures. And then finally use those measures to decide what should happen next, okay? And so this is a nice framework that helps us think about what's the effective change process looks like. And I should mention that goals of large scale go through this process, but also goals of really small scale can go through this process too. And it's all relative what large and small mean. But if you compare implementing a whole coordination system to a smaller scale goal of acquiring funding for a dedicated coordinator position, that's a smaller scale, but that still is something that goes through this process. So this is something that we'll also refer to later. But Seminal as a group, added additional assumptions to this effective change process. And one of the initial assumptions is that that groups have to start by determining what's their common vision of success, and that all relevant stakeholders have to be involved. And then there's this acknowledgement that change is complex. So among those stakeholders that are involved, some of them need to be change agents. They need to be the one with their feet on the ground, taking the initiative, doing the emailing, doing the communicating, and making sure that their plan is progressing. And finally, there's the additional assumption that the mathematical rigor is important. So it's not just about implementing something like a coordination system, but they can't forget about the mathematics that's involved. So we have these ideas about what's changed. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about who is SEMINAL as a research group. So SEMINAL as a research group is a collaborative research group with a $3 million NFS IUs grant. And it's a collaboration among APL, University of Colorado, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and San Diego State University. And it consists of 3 phases, which I'll talk more about in the next slide. But it has an overall overall goal of better understanding how do we enact and support institutional change aimed at implementing active learning in undergraduate mathematics learning environments. So SEMINAL has 3 phases, and so it has this overall goal of determining how do we do this active learning within our departments. And phase 1 has focused on 6 retroactive case studies. And so SEMINAL picked 6 departments who had successfully implemented active learning within their departments and collected and analyzed data to try to learn, well, how did they do it? What did they do? What lessons can we take away from these departments? And so then phase 2, because phase 1 focused on a retroactive look, phase 2 is looking at departments who are currently in the throes of trying to start getting active learning within their departments, or very new early on in that process. And so that involves 9 departments, and it's an incentivized it's an incentivized case study. So these 9 departments made a plan, applied for, and received seed funding from SEMINAL. And we are doing 3 site visits across 3 years within these sites. And then finally, phase 3 is looking at 12 different sites and seeing how are they trying to do active learning within their department and networking about it within communities. So for each of these 3 phases, we have been collecting and will continue to collect lots of different kinds of data. So we're interviewing a lot of different people. We're observing classes in person before the pandemic, and trying to do that in other ways in the pandemic. We are collecting local data. So we've designed and implemented instructor and student surveys. We're looking at DFW rates. And then we've had each of these sites do self-studies that have helped us learn their institutional context from their perspective. So today we're only talking about change levers from phase 1. And so there were 6 departments that were included in phase 1. So this is a quick snapshot of these 6 departments. So you'll see that the departments range between 20,000 to 30,000 undergrads. Most of them were R1 institutions, but there was one R2 institution and there was one R3 institution. And that department size ranged from 70 to 80, all the way up to pretty large, for 220 to even 300 was our largest department. And so for each of these 6 departments, they had their own unique story about how active learning came to be implemented in their department. So at All In University, their story started with the department chair and task force that they just decided and created a detailed plan that literally had them go all in on implementing active learning and tightening the coordination within their department. And at Crossroads University, they had tried the Emporium model, but at some point the department chair and the task force created decided that they needed to move towards implementing active learning and not using the Emporium model. And then Critical Response University, their story really started in the form of a crisis where they had bad grades and little coordination, and their task force then decided to push a plan to implement active learning and coordination. And then, like Critical Response University, Long-Term University's story started from student complaints about calculus, and they have had the changes of active learning and coordination in place for multiple decades, hence why they're called Long-Term University. And then Phased Change University, their story really started with a couple of department leaders pushing to use active learning projects within Calculus 1, which led to them wanting to have more coordination within this course, and this ultimately led to expansion among other courses. And then finally, Grassroots University is where their active learning use is being done by individual faculty members within their department, and that their department chair had recently hired, or not recently, but had intentionally hired faculty members who were interested in using active learning. So these are the 6 institutions. And one thing I want to point out is that the first 5 are ones that had an intentional use of coordination, and that Grassroots University was the only one that did not really have any coordination in their department, but that still used active learning.
Okay, so I'm going to switch now. And Molly, if you want to stop sharing your screen, I'm going to share the result of the word cloud.
Yep.
Here we go. We were just using a free one, so I can't make it like not show the ads and things on the sides, but in the middle, you can see that out of all the phrases that you put at the beginning, it's very obvious you were all writing about students, because students is right there as the most frequently listed. Some of the other words that got mentioned a lot, were math or mathematically, but also faculty, and I see empowered was mentioned a lot, working, equitable, collaborating. So yeah, it's always interesting to do these things and then show how the words all fit together. But I see a lot of also, experiences, feeling welcome, doing activities. So it's clearly, students are doing things and things are being equitable. I guess since I'm showing my screen, I'll just keep going and then I'll switch back to you, Molly, at the next part.
That sounds great.
So one of the things we want to talk about is that, when a lot of people think about starting active learning, you're thinking about your own classroom and you're thinking about, what activities am I doing with students? How do I structure it? How do I get students to talk in class? Maybe things like how do I manage group work? And that is super important. The Seminal grant has been looking bigger and been thinking about how do we do this not in one person's classroom or 50 people's classroom, but how do we get this that the whole culture of the department is that the norm is that we are actively engaging students and not just leaning back on lecture, which we know is not the most effective way, as Molly was showing earlier. And so when we think about seeing the whole system, we're thinking about, yes, there's, the students are involved, obviously, instructors, there's kind of this classroom level where the instructors and students are working on the math, but then there's this department level where there's, multiple people teaching the same course, multiple courses involved, students move from course to course. There's institutional context, and there's, the department. So there's all these different levels. And here we have them in these nice little concentric circles, but this is, an image to show different aspects of the system, but really it's super messy. And there's all these different connections in all these different ways. But these are thinking about, if you're doing active learning, not just in your classroom, but in your whole department, thinking about things at different levels. And so when we originally started Seminal, we were thinking about just a few pieces. And so we were thinking about, okay, there's the classroom level, about the activities, how you get students to talk to each other, how the instructor is thinking about what students are thinking, making sure there's mathematical rigor and coherence, that kind of things, assessment. And then we were thinking about the department level, about leadership, about how student placement, that don't worry about some of these acronyms because we're going to explain them all in a moment. We were thinking about the classroom and the department level. And then really quickly, once we started actually collecting data, we realized that this was not enough, that we really needed to be thinking about the institutional level also, and these extra levels. And so some of the initial things is we were noticing that the institutions that had managed to change their department culture so that active learning was the norm, they had this kind of community identity about how we do things and how we teach. There was this campus culture that valued teaching and teaching innovation and rewarded it. There were effective leaders who were opportunistic, who would take the advantage of, oh, there's a new building. Hey, instead of bolting all the chairs down, let's have chairs and tables that move. Don't bother with all the extra technology. Give us more whiteboards all around, that kind of thing. There was this willingness to pay the cost of improved instruction, knowing that it's not just free to magically, double your pass rate. There was coordination of multi-section courses, which was really focused on equity, making sure students had equitable experiences. So people weren't just using the same textbook, although some of them needed to start there, get the same textbook, but also down to thinking about common assessments, common grading of common assessments, in some cases, common lessons, common activities. There was support, so it wasn't just telling people you need to stop lecturing now, but it was more about supporting people to teach them how do you get students to work in groups. There was flexibility, knowing that the first thing you try is not necessarily going to be what you end up at. And then there was a plan for turnover of people, because we know that that different people are teaching the course. You get new department chairs, you get new deans. And we're mostly focused on phase one, but phase one, when we were studying them, had already been sustaining changes. And so I just wanted to mention a little bit on phase two. These were places that were starting to change and trying to change their culture. And so a lot of them really focused on initiating or expanding this course coordination, including for a lot of them moving to having common assessments. They focused on hiring, hiring people whose full or part-time job was to coordinate these courses, and to hire learning assistants, which are other students who have finished the course, who come back and help manage the group work. Hiring instructors who also value active learning. Thinking about how you teach people how to teach with active learning, rethinking their placement policies, getting access to local data, developing active learning materials, thinking about how to do things culturally responsively and not just maybe naked number problems, and making a plan for how this will be sustained. So earlier, Molly had mentioned that we had, you need an n-dimensional solution to go with an n-dimensional problem. So here we have n equals 9. Now this does not mean that, everybody has 9, but these were the main things that have been coming out of the seminal research. And so I'm going to be talking about these in a little bit more detail, each of them, but all of these change levers or dimensions for change, it needs the involvement of everybody. And everybody, from campus administrators, from the provost and dean levels to chairs, vice chairs, faculty task force, course coordinators, researchers for math education, all the instructors at every level, so, students, this is it's a whole cultural change to get the department to shift to thinking this is how we are teaching. So local data or using data. And so one of the levers was for people in the departments to get access to the university data system, which sometimes meant actually getting their hands on actual, access databases or whatever database the university used. But sometimes it was getting access to a person, because the university had a data office and a person who was happy to work with departments to help them see the information that they needed. And people looked at all kinds of data. The rates of students getting D's or F's or withdrawing, that's a kind of typical measure of success, or the complement of that, of the pass rate. So that's one thing, but there also might be something like attendance, like are students using the tutoring or learning center? Are they coming to class? Course taking trajectories, after they take college algebra, do they then take a trigonometry class and pass it? Or after calculus 1, do they take calculus 2 and pass it? Student surveys, looking at what students believe, interviewing students and instructors to hear kind of firsthand their experiences, doing observations, especially peer observations, to see what's happening in other people's classes, thinking about collecting data on common assessments at the item level to see what's hard, or are there sections of the course that are standing out as outliers. And one of the things is that a big caution, data are not self-interpreting. So you don't want to just look at numbers and pass numbers off to people. And that looking at local data can be a structure that the department can use to help sustain efforts or motivate efforts. Sometimes it takes some nudging to get people to realize that lecture is not as good as they think it is. Like, yes, lecture is how a lot of us were taught how to teach, but sometimes it takes data to show people that there are other better ways that are more successful for students. So all these changes take leadership. You need a department chair who's committed to the effort. And if the department chair is neutral, like that can be fine, but you want to be able to work to try to get them so that they are an active advocate. A lot of places ended up with a faculty committee that either initiated the efforts or helped to sustain it, so that if one person leaves, it doesn't just all fall apart. Leaders were able to align the changes to the university goals. When you're aligned to university efforts, that's how you can shake some resources loose sometimes. Getting positions like coordinators that are semi-permanent, so people aren't just new every semester taking over being in charge of calculus, and actually planning for the turnover are all kind of characteristics of the leaders. And one of the things is from the organizational change literature we found is that thinking of a chair as kind of a middle manager, because they're managing the department, but then they're also, kind of managing up to manage, the deans and the higher administrators for the expectations and trying to get it all to work together. So another lever obviously is active learning. And so this idea that there's group work in class for the majority of the time, focusing on applying the mathematics. And active learning does not mean you're never telling students anything, but it does mean that students are doing more of the work, as so many of you put in the chat. And that it's not restricted to only small sections. In larger sections, it can look different. Maybe it's clicker questions, but you can still have students turning and talking. And some of the departments, what they did was find, the people who were trying things first and getting at this kind of mindset that the first thing you try, it doesn't always work the first time. And so, trying again and trying to, doing observations and talking to other instructors can be ways that can help this move on and continue. Students, when they're in active learning situations that are positive, some of them realize that when they run into problems that individually they get stuck, but together as a group, they can figure it out. And students realize, oh, I can get together and talk to other people, and talking about math is a good way to learn it. So another kind of lever for change is this idea of common instructional activities. And so a lot of the campuses involved developed common worksheets or common kind of course packets. Common assessment of having common homework, common quizzes, common exams or midterms. Not every campus did all of these in common, but all of them did something in common. A common textbook, and then OER is the open educational resources, so the free online textbooks like Active Calculus. And then this common messaging to students and instructors, because students are also used to being lectured at in math class. And so if you change that, it takes some active work to get students to see their role in learning and to accept that that their role is not to passively watch the instructor do math for them. And there's a lot of all well-designed instructional materials that are available. So starting to think about activities, please don't start from zero and try to reinvent every wheel. But also, it doesn't mean that to take everything out there and just use it as is. So there's great ways to adapt it locally. That can also increase instructor buy-in if instructors are not just being handed something, but asked to help co-create things or revise them. But you can also then, by having some materials already as a resource, instructors can spend more of their energy on some of the really hard aspects, like figuring out how to get students to work cooperatively in groups and not worrying as much about what's a good example to try next. So let's say I've already mentioned, thinking about these kind of elements of coordination. So, common textbook, common syllabus, but this idea of shared lesson plans or shared worksheets, this can really take off some of the instructional burden. And not that one person necessarily is creating these, but maybe a group creates these and then revisits them periodically as a way to help share the burden when you are trying to all change things. Common exams, and then weekly instructor meetings, because a really important aspect of coordination is the people doing the coordinating and that the instructors are talking to each other, not just about, oh, did you get to chapter 3 yet, but things about, oh, we're about to do, solving for rational roots. What's hard about that? What do students usually, like about this? What are some good examples? And, talking about what's hard for students or what students appreciate in terms of learning how to do the mathematics. So yeah, so coordination systems have two goals. So it's building a supportive network and community among instructors and making sure that students have an equitable and high quality learning experience. So this coordination it's a key way to try to get at equity so that you don't just have luck of the draw that, oh, students in the 10:30 in the morning section pass at twice the rate as students in the 8:30 in the morning section. And then professional development. Like I said, you can't just tell people to stop lecturing. There needs to be, instruction before the semester. There need to be these instructor meetings that can talk about how to get students to work in groups and good ways to teach different topics. Your department might have or start a teaching seminar where there's just like a regular department colloquium where you talk about issues of teaching. Sometimes instructors get to travel to workshops like the inquiry-based learning workshops that go on many summers. And there might be a pedagogy course for graduate student instructors or learning assistants to help teach the learning assistants and the other graduate assistants how to help support active learning. And this we can't emphasize this enough, that it's not just a one-time like, oh, I went and learned how to do that once, but effective instructors are always trying to get better at instruction. And so it takes ongoing support to be able to do that. And so, one instructor mentioned that, it's really tempting for them to really just tell people like, here's the right order to do the math. But when you are just telling them, you're taking away the ownership of knowledge from the students. And it just helps students think about, well, math is just rules to memorize. So thinking about, when you're doing active learning, you're trying to get students to take ownership of the math. So I mentioned instructor community of practice. And I want to make sure we have time for the group work. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but these, having these weekly meetings are important. And having these shared opportunities to have course meetings, observe each other, professional development. These are kind of some of the main pieces that we're able to help sustain through the turnover in instructors. So undergraduate learning assistants, they support group work and get trained on how to ask student questions and not just immediately answer any question that students have. But they meet with instructors, they reflect, they share, give information back to the instructors, and they're recruited from students who have already taken the course. Many colleges have been restricting it to students who'd maybe gotten an A in the previous course, but not all of them. Some of them say, actually, the people who struggled and like came out of it with a B, or even a C+, like they understand what it meant for students to struggle. And they can be really helpful when doing group work because, especially in larger classes, one instructor can't necessarily support 15 groups all at the same time. And so having an extra bodies in the room to help support the groups is a good, or a reason that many places used learning assistants. And then the last one is thinking about the actual environment. Is it possible to get dedicated, renovated classrooms that have tables and chairs and whiteboards all around? And another instructional resource or environment resource is more time. At least 2 of the universities successfully argued math class should be treated more like a science lab, where the number of minutes in class doesn't exactly equate to the number of credit hours. And so they were able to do this and move things like 50-minute classes turned into 75-minute classes, which gave more time for students to sit and kind of struggle with the mathematics and make sense of it. And you can certainly do active learning in an auditorium where everything is bolted down, but it is easier to facilitate group work when students can physically sit facing each other and have places to show their work, like on whiteboards all around. Okay, and now, let's see, I think we are switching. We're doing another poll. So let me, of course, now I'm the one sharing my screen, so I need to pause that so I can drop some links in.
I'm just going to drop in just before you, Wendy, I'm just going to drop in the document that we've created for all the key takeaways to the different things that you had just talked about. So everybody should have access to this. It's not editable, but it's definitely something you can look at when it comes to our key takeaways from our Seminal 1 data.
And then, do you want me to go back to sharing my screen?
Yeah,
Okay.
Let's do that.
Perfect.
So we have created a poll just to think about what are the key takeaways and change levers that you want to work on within your department, within your institution. And so if you go ahead and click on the link that is in the chat, it should give you an option for how to rank these. And then we're going to actually have some discussion about what we're seeing for the folks that are here in this meeting. So take a few minutes, think about what are the ways that you would rank or how you would rank the different change levers. We'll give you about another half a minute or so.
If you want to switch back to my screen, Molly, I can share the results. It looks like everybody is submitted. All right, so at first it's making kind of an unhelpful bar graph, but by far and away, active learning is the #1 thing that people were listing. About half of you did that. But if I kind of scroll down, I don't know if I can make this bigger in the moment, but it looks like active learning ranked between 1 and 6. It was mostly, ranked in your top 3. Instructional materials kind of was all over the place. Coordination, a lot of them were kind of all over the place, but active learning was definitely the top. You can kind of just get a picture of, out of the 9 levers, six of them showed up as #1. So, yeah. And one of the messages of Seminal is that, there's not one right place to start, that everybody has a different local context. And so thinking about what's happening at your context, makes your own set of priorities.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. It takes me a minute.
All right, so if we're looking at, excuse me, just looking at the revisiting the different systems that we've already talked about now in regard to change levers. So change levers are going to both be affected by this change process. So the goal setting, the understanding the system, how you're going to measure that, how you're going to plan. but it's also affecting our system of stakeholders that go all the way from the instructional level, and that includes students, through the institutional level. And that's something that, that we have to be mindful of. Like, how do these things interact with one another? And what are the ways that we can kind of lean on the different change levers to make change actually happen, specifically regarding active learning, since that seems to be what most people had as the highest thing ranked. And I'm actually just going to turn it over to Molly because she has an example that she'll go through about a specific institution.
Yeah, so in a moment, we're going to have you all in breakout rooms to talk about which change lever you picked that you would want to work on at your institution or your department. And so to help, and we want you to think about how do you connect that to this, how change happens and who is involved in a minute. And so I want to give you an example from one of our 6 institutions. So at Crossroads University, they were the university where they had done a pilot year with the Emporium model, and they had seen some success. But when they met to talk about what to do next, they realized that to continue with the Emporium model, they would have to give up some of their graduate teaching assistants, because that's one of the benefits of the Emporium model. And the department leader at the time really did not like that idea and made the decision that that is not what she wanted the department to do. And so she decided that they would not continue with the Emporium model, and that they would move towards implementing active learning within their classrooms and getting coordination going more. And so for that particular thing, this leadership takeaway really reflects a really big moment in their change story process. So so the department leader, I put a star on the decide goal, because for her, she was the person who really impacted that part of the change process. She decided the goal and set the course after that, and that really impacted the star in the department for like everybody who was involved in the department with this. And so as you can imagine, it leads to other key takeaways that were important to their story. So once they decided to make this direction to use active learning, part of their plan was, oh, we'd like to have classrooms actually set up that would help facilitate this kind of learning. So they, so another really important part of this story is that they had to make a plan for actually how to do this, to create classrooms set up like this. And that involved getting support and funding from the institutional level, because at this particular university, classrooms were not owned by departments, they are owned by the institution. So they had to go through people and hoops in order to be able to do that. And so then finally, as I mentioned, part of their plan going in this direction was to have a tighter role of coordination. And so for them, it wasn't just about helping GTAs become better teachers, which was important to them, but they also decided they really wanted to have ensure that students were having a fair and high quality learning experience. So part of the decision there was looking at that they saw high variability among their GTAs as instructors. So this, obviously, I put the star for the how change happened. It was all over this, they needed to decide a goal and understand a system. It was a really large goal for them to have to figure out, okay, we want to do more with coordination. And that involved a lot of people from the department level, the classroom level, and the instructor level. So this is the moment where we want to turn you all into small groups of about 5. And in your groups, we want you to think about the key takeaway or change levers that you picked as your number 1 or your number 1 and 2 that you want to work on first or next. And we want you to think about who in this system is important, and then how would this change lever need to move through the change process at your context, and what has to happen for this change to be successful in your context. And if you're someone whose department is already far along into the change process, this might be a moment where you reflect on your own change story and think about what key takeaways or change levers have we shared here that were important, and who and how did it move through the change process. So I'm going to have, we're going to move into breakout rooms of about 5, and then someone will copy and paste these questions into the chat box so that you have them. So is this, I think this is, maybe we're,
Yep, Pat's gonna move everybody into groups of 5.
Are you ready to move them?
Yep.
yes. You beat me to it, Wendy.
Oh, dropping links. I was trying to stay on top of that since I knew when you're sharing your screen, you can't see it.
No, I
Yeah,
didn't
because
think,
then I was sharing my screen. When I was sharing my screen from it, I was like, oh wait, now I can't see it to drop the links.
so we're thinking about like 10-ish minutes.
Yeah, or yeah, I think pulling them back at, well, 10 or 15 to give them all a chance to talk.
We're
Maybe
better
bring them
on
back
time.
at like,
Yeah, we're better on
bring them
time.
back at like 10 or 12 after the hour.
There's one room that only has 2 people in it because the others haven't joined. Do you want me to move those into different rooms or just let the 2 of them?
Yeah, I think it's probably better to have a slightly bigger group.
Okay, I'm gonna, I don't know what's gonna happen here, but I'm gonna join their room and tell them that I'll relocate them.
Great.
Stay at a different pace or do different things in their lecture, and trying to support student success with different lecture instructors has been our challenge. So I put actually coordination and those kind of priorities as what my department could work on.
Are you at a university?
Yes, it is a 4-year.
See, I'm at a community college and we have been working on doing active learning and getting that into all our.
You can probably pause the recording, Pat, while they're in the breakout groups.
Change and resources for the next steps. So in regard to just cultural change in general, this is organizational theory from Shine. So if you are interested in kind of looking at some research from an organizational theorist, an organizational strategy is determined by its culture. And I think that's kind of been woven within our presentation, looking at all of the different levers and all of the pieces that are going to inhibit or help change when it comes to active learning in departments. So thinking about this historical context that organizations stem from, like the foundations of the department, how it was created, all of the things associated with that, all the way through the biases and theories of the members that are in leadership. And this is kind of from that system that we saw before where it had instructor, classroom, department, institution, the things that ground those beliefs in culture. And culture is something that does not change quickly, right? So many people that work in institutions like to say that we are kind of this large ship and it's hard to turn us quickly to change. So within this adaptation from Shine, you're going to see geospatial. That was in relation to the physical classrooms that we have. And I'm just going to put this in context of active learning. Geospatial would be the physical classrooms. What are our chairs like? What are our desks like? What technology do we have? Some of the traditions then might be related to how we've been teaching. If we're in a culture where lecture has been the dominant method of transfer of knowledge, we're kind of running up against some of the traditions that are deeply held by a department. Behavioral patterns are related to that and organizational processes. So that could be that if lecture and you being maybe more of a silo kind of piece to your department, where you're not necessarily doing coordination. So if you're taking on active learning, coordination is probably going to be part of that, or offering professional development is going to be a piece to that. And then that second circle, just before you get to the center, are the ways that your department, whether it's the leaders, colleagues, students, how they talk about the culture in the department, but the embedded values and beliefs is what really informs the decision making. So kind of keeping that in mind. Some of the ways that they suggest to cultivate change, and I think you see this again throughout the presentation, is you want to assess and benchmark what's currently happening in your department. So if your change lever wasn't on active learning, let's say your focus was on learning environments and you want to make those learning environments more inclusive, you're going to want to document what's currently happening in your department. So going and actually seeing what the classrooms are like, getting feedback from students, deciding, okay, here's a snapshot of what our current learning environment looks like in our department classrooms. This gather feedback, this next piece, is really related to, once you have that snapshot, can you determine if that is actually true from the multiple stakeholders that you have within your department? So from the students all the way through the institutional leadership. So if that's your department chair who makes a lot of decisions, or a faculty committee, to say, okay, this is what I'm seeing within our learning environment. Are you also getting this sort of picture as well from the culture that we have within our space? And then if the folks within that space do agree that they want to change the learning environment to make it more inclusive, actually transforming the culture, which takes a substantial period of time and a lot of investment, which we had talked about the 9 different levers regarding the seminal phase 1 institutions. And for you at each of your different institutions, it could be various things that you're wanting to identify that are going to help transform that culture to get you to that next level.
All right, so we're just going to wrap up with a couple resources, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat so that you have a link. This is basically the link so you can view our slides, so you can be able to click on all these links. So I'm not going to drop every link from every slide, but to just offer some quick resources. So Seminal recently published a book, and by recently I mean this month. It's hot off the presses, now fresh for ordering. And it's a partnership between AMS, MAA, and the Conference Board of Mathematical Sciences. And the book is meant for people who are trying to change their department, to be able to shift it to a culture of active learning. And it's not meant to be read front to back. It's meant to be read in chunks where you decide, like, okay, the first thing I want to really think about is coordination. So I'm going to just read that coordination chapter first. So it's designed to be taken in pieces. There's also the journal Primus has a special issue, kind of a triple special issue, and it's got 26 different stories of how people got change started in their departments. So that is also available there online. And if your institution, hopefully your institution subscribes to that journal, because that's a pretty useful journal for teaching mathematics courses. But if not, let me know and we can probably get you copies of at least some of the articles. Another really useful resource is there's a group called the Accelerating Systemic Change Network. And so they're all about how do you help departments make the kind of changes that they want. So they have a book, which is a free PDF version linked here. And they also have a change dashboard, which is a really useful tool for doing what Rebecca was just saying, of figuring out where are you at? What are your priorities? Like what is the first problem you want to try to address, and how are you going to do it? And what progress are you making? There's also a book called Increasing Student Success in STEM, a guide to institutional and systemic change. And it's an actual physical book, and it's pretty useful, but it's got a lot of checklists of thinking about, what do you need to do to get started. If you're not a big fan of checklists, this is probably not for you, but it is a useful kind of workbook. And then there's a group called the Mathematics Teacher Education Partnership that they're actually focused on preparing math teachers, but one dimension of preparing math teachers is teaching college math classes better and working on that recruitment pipeline, starting in 2-year colleges through to 4-year colleges to get teaching certification. And so one of the chapters in this book is focused on active learning, including developing curriculum resources and how to get started. And then, so these were all like print materials or like resource kind of things, but a huge way to keep this going is to be part of a network with other people. And so here are just a few of the communities that we know are out there. So the Accelerating Systemic Change Network has like a listserv and a newsletter, and they have working groups. And so that's a place to get involved. Other online communities, the acronym COMMIT network is about communities of communities of practice of instructors of mathematics. They're not, it's still kind of regional, so there may or may not be one of those in your area, but both the MAA and AMATYC have these online communities where you can be part of, having conversations with other people focused on these same issues. So if you're not part of these communities yet, I strongly urge you to join them. If you're a member of either MAA or AMATYC, you can do it for free. In AMATYC, there's even a friend of AMATYC option to be able to join the communities to have the conversations. And then the Mathematical Sciences Research Institute or near Berkeley, California, has a critical issues in math education conference every year. Well, every year with a big asterisk because COVID, but pretty much every year. So the 2021 conference is going to be held in March of 2022, and it's going to be focused on these exact issues, but also extending down to high school, and like how do we get that transition of like high school math through 2-year college, through 4-year college, and get it all with active learning. And there's also a project which I needed to put on this, but we forgot, but it's called Teaching for Prowess. And April might be able to say a little bit more about that since she's heavily involved, but it is the idea of getting community colleges and 2-year colleges on board with active learning, and how do you get this going? So we wanted to save time for questions. Oh good, April dropped a link for the Teaching for Prowess in the chat, very good. So yes, there's one more link. And so we're open for questions. So I think at this point, it's a small enough group if you wanted to unmute, or there's under Google or Zoom, there's the reactions. You can click raise your hand, and then we'll see that you have a question, and we'll invite you to do that, or you can drop your question in the chat and we'll look at that. And so we'll do questions for a couple minutes, and then we'll have kind of a 1-minute, very quick wrap up.
And I should add, it's questions or comments from, like, if there was anything said during your breakout group that you wanted to share, or something new that made you think about. So that's also welcomed here, not just questions. But we like questions too.
So I see a question about changing to 7-week terms and advice. So one of the things that we found really useful in switching to active learning was it prompted the whole department to have conversations about what is important, like what really has to be in college algebra. Because when we were switching from lecturing to active learning, like it's really easy to cram in and like start a new topic every lecture and just like tell everybody all the things, but they don't learn all the things. And so we had conversations about what really is most important to keep, what are the big ideas. And so having those conversations as a department about what were the big ideas. And yeah, I see Edward made the comment backward design. So starting from this learning objectives, and we started actually with like a map from our intermediate algebra, college algebra, trig, pre-calculus, calc 1, calc 2, business calc, calc 3. Like we tried to map and think like, all right, if this is, if these are the trajectories, like what do we really have to do that are like the top things? And you can't have top 30 things. Like it's not the top 30 things. It's, in some cases it's like the top 18 things. So that's, a little bit more than like one a week, but we tried to really cut. And we made some pretty significant cuts, but we did it as a whole department, well, it was some working groups, but everybody had input. So nobody felt like, oh, this is just being done to me. But we did have to get a few people, they wanted to make statements like, oh, you're taking this out of this class, like, no, never. But it's like, well, but something's got to give. And like, what's the most important for what we need them to know and be able to do? So that's not actually an answer other than to say, have conversations, and hopefully they're framed in ways that people understand. Like you're going to have to drop, let go of some things.
I would add to that too, that like there's extra incentive to really make sure there are active learning opportunities in there, right? Because you probably have longer class sessions for shorter 7 weeks, and burnout can happen really quickly. And so if you're making sure that that they're having opportunities to move from listening to like actually doing things, that really will help. And it's just an extra incentive to make sure that those kinds of opportunities are there.
I was wondering if anyone taught hybrid this year doing group work or expects to be doing that in the fall. I taught purely online this year, and I'm expecting to be teaching mostly face-to-face, except for the students who are quarantining or whatever in the fall, and just really trying to wrap my head around how I'm going to do group work with 3-foot physical distancing and possibly some people not even in the room. Anybody have any thoughts?
We did that this year. And in the fall, we're actually not, other than the students quarantine. We're making everyone come back because, yes, anyway, I'm not going to get into the politics of our state, but we did do that this past year. And what we did was we actually expanded the learning assistants that we hired. So we made sure that for a hybrid class, there was one person physically in the room and one person managing the online groups. And then like people in the room were groups with people in the room, and the people online were groups with people online. And, you know, sometimes it varied whether it was like the instructor was in the room or the instructor was online. We tried to put the instructor with the majority of the people so that they were handling the bigger group. And one of the things we did is, this was not related to Seminole, but there was a partnership between my university and the local community college. And so the local community college actually hired math majors from our university to go be the learning assistants there so that they had enough of a population. But yeah, I don't know how people do it when they were the only instructor, but we did it with 2. And we hired extra learning assistants to make that work.
And for the physical distancing that you're talking about, we had that stipulation too, that you still had to be 6 feet apart in person and with the hybrid. And so what we would do is we would put the questions up on we had boards within the space, and we'd have students come kind of in a rotation because they still could not be physically close to one another, which made it a little difficult when it came to hearing each other, but at least then they could communicate mathematically on the board and see what each other was doing in that face-to-face component. I think with the online component, they were using like their tablet or the annotate method to actually communicate with one another.
April, do you want to go ahead and wrap us up here?
Yes, that sounds good. Go ahead and page to the next slide. As I opened with this reference to the National Math Summit, I just wanted to close us out and mention that we are having a conference called the National Math Summit. It happens to be the 4th one we've been able to offer. If you advance one more slide, you'll have the dates and times. Monday, June 14th, we're going to open the session with Jenna Carpenter as our keynote speaker. We're also having sessions on Tuesday, June 15th. The registration is here in the chat. And so if you are interested in joining us for this particular conference, of course it's virtual. So hopefully you're able to do that. Looking forward to that opportunity. All these organizations are coming together for this as usual for the National Math Summit. So AMATYC, NOS, Paul Nolting, and then supporting partners with the Dana Center, Carnegie, and the MAA, as I previously mentioned. So hopefully you can join us. Please register soon. And thank you so much for joining us here in this webinar today. And also want to thank our speakers from Seminole. So appreciate your time and investment and sharing back with us about the project. All right, happy summer to everybody.